Well, good morning, everyone. How are we doing today?
Cold.
We're cold. Other folks? Same, cold. This room is definitely not very warm. My little CO2 monitor thing also has a temperature gauge on it. It says it's only 64 degrees in here. It's not warm in this room, but oh well. Okay, I am recording. So, first, I wanted to go over the logistics for the quiz on these first three rules, the stuff we've been doing these first couple of weeks. The first due date for that quiz is tomorrow evening, Friday, January 31st at 6 p.m. It is, you can turn it in a little bit after 6, but I don't like to really set the deadline to like midnight so much because I want to encourage you to enjoy your Friday evenings and relax a little bit and not just work on schoolwork. So the first due date for this first quiz is tomorrow evening. To find it, you go to Cat Courses, go into our class, and right up here at the top, it says go to modules to check assignments. You can click on this, or you can click where it says modules over here. Make this a little larger. So go to modules to check assignments. And this is the primary way you will track, let me switch to a student view. This is the primary way you will track your progress through doing the work to pass the class or get an A. Initially, everything is locked until you pass the 3 assignments for this first unit. And you have to do these in order. So you have to pass this first quiz, and then you can move on to the argument maps quiz, and then you can move on to the finding arguments quiz or activity to be determined. Haven't quite figured out what I want to do for this one yet. So you come in here, and there are instructions, then you hit this to start working on the quiz. So you go to modules to check the assignments. You look for the analyzing arguments section. This one right here. It might be folded down like that. And the rules 1 to 3 quiz, right there. The quiz has 10 questions, 4 different kinds of questions. First, given an argument in prose form, that is as a paragraph, identify the conclusion. The idea here is mostly that you're copying and pasting, although the automatic grading system is a little oversensitive, like it's not great. Like if the capitalization doesn't match what it's expecting or the punctuation doesn't match what it's expecting, it will mark that incorrect, but when we grade it manually, we will check that and mark it correct. Okay, so don't worry too much about punctuation and capitalization. Point here is to identify the conclusion, basically just copy and paste. So you have 3 of those, then 1 question where you have to pick one of the 3 arguments you just looked at and put it into premise conclusion form. So you've already identified the conclusion, now you have to go and put it in premise conclusion form. This one you have to pass in order to pass the quiz. The others, there's a little bit of slack, but you have to pass this question. You have to be able to put an argument in premise conclusion form in order to be able to move on, because that's just like fundamental to everything else we do in the semester. Next, thinking about acceptability, you'll be given 3 claims. For each claim, you need to identify an audience that would probably accept it and an audience that probably wouldn't accept it. We did 1 example of that at the very end last time. We're going to do some more today. And then finally, the 3rd set of questions are true and false questions about acceptability and support. We haven't talked about support yet. That's what we're going to be doing mostly today. Okay? So that's the structure of the quiz. Hopefully won't take you too long. And it's a total of 12 points, and you need 10 points to pass. So you can basically miss 2 of the 1-point questions and still pass the quiz. For practice, on the online notes, I have a whole page that runs over the structure of the quiz, gives you examples for particular questions. So here I have 2 worked examples. Here's a pair of arguments, and identify the conclusion, put them in premise conclusion form. And then 14 more arguments that you can practice with on your own or in your study groups or Polyphony might use in discussion tomorrow. Same thing with controversial claims. This is somebody who probably would accept it, somebody who probably would not accept it. I give you a few worked examples here, and then you have like 15 more that you can practice with. Acceptability and support. Total of 16 example true-false claims about acceptance and support. For these at the top, the answers and a brief explanation are included. And then for the others, you hit the details thing, and that brings up the answer. So like the answers are slightly hidden, so you can think about them on your own first. Okay? So you have all of these basically practice problems that you can work with. The quiz is basically open everything with 2 important provisos. You must work on your own, and use of large language models is not allowed. Large language models, also, I've tested this. I've tested these questions on a few different large language models, ChatGPT, Claude, things like that. And generally, they're not super helpful on these quizzes anyways, because I'm asking like about the specific concept of acceptability that we're working with, and the specific concept of support, and how exactly we're doing premise conclusion form. And large language models, by their nature, aren't good at like thinking about what's going on in this like one particular classroom with these particular definitions. Okay? So LLM's not super helpful, but you're not allowed to use them on this quiz anyways. Okay, now you might not feel ready yet. Support in particular is a very challenging concept. A lot of students get it kind of confused with acceptability, and we're really only going to have like part of today to talk about support and whatever happens in discussion section. You might not feel ready yet. That is totally fine. We are going to be putting this quiz on like a due date every week, so you will have another opportunity to take it again next week. The quizzes draw on pretty large question banks, so even if you saw it once, you can take it again, and you'll get to see a different set of questions in the same areas. If you do try it this week and you don't pass this time, that's okay. You'll get feedback from whoever does the manual grading, and then it's also set up to give you some automatic feedback. And you'll be able to try again next week, no penalty. All that matters is that eventually you pass the quiz. Most students, I haven't done exactly this quiz format before, but the similar assignment I used to do in the previous version of this course, about 80% of students got it on their first try. So that means most people didn't have a problem with it. A few people needed a second or very, very occasionally a third shot. So don't feel bad if this stuff is confusing and you need to try a second or even a third time. Okay. Any questions about the quiz? Yes.
So, given that I'm looking at the correct quiz and judging by the fact that it's the only available one, I suspect that I am. Without specifying anything about the question, some questions ask you to provide things in premise conclusion form. Does it matter the formatting that I put this in? Do you want it premise, colon, and then the premise, and then conclusion, colon, and then the conclusion? Or do you want me to say, here's the premise, here's the conclusion? Does it matter?
So the crucial things for premise conclusion form are, let's see, do we have this? Do I have this handy? Yeah. Each claim is on its own line, each line is numbered, and the conclusion is at the end. Those are the crucial things that we'll be looking for. The premise conclusion form question has to be manually graded because I can't tell CAT courses exactly how that's going to be formatted for some of the reasons you were talking about. So these are the three things we will be looking for premise conclusion form. Each claim on its own line, each line is numbered, conclusion at the end. Alexa.
On the questions about acceptability,
Yeah.
are they giving us options or are they open-ended?
They're open-ended. Yeah, so those, again, those are things that have to be manually graded. You don't need a lot of detail. Where are the examples? The wisdom of elders should guide modern decisions. This would probably be accepted by traditional societies, probably not accepted by youth advocates and many scientists. Not a lot of detail, it just has to be, okay, yeah, I can see how the first group of people would probably accept this claim, the second group of people probably wouldn't. And it's basically that plausibility check.
For premise conclusion form,
Yeah.
does the line with the conclusion also have to be numbered?
I usually do because I'm creating these with enumerated lists, like the automatic formatting for a numbered list. And it's actually really hard to fit in a final line that isn't numbered. The number for the conclusion isn't, you look at, for example, some critical reasoning or some logic textbooks, they don't always number the final line. I think it will probably be easier if you're numbering the final line, but that's probably not something we're going to say, no, you don't understand premise conclusion form over. There was another hand. Oakley?
For the acceptability part, when we need to put who would and who wouldn't accept it, is there a minimum amount that we need
Sorry, could you say that again?
For the acceptability part,
Yeah.
is there a minimum amount of groups that we need to put? Like, does there at least need to be 2, or is it just at least 1?
In the examples, I had 1 or 2. 2 can be nice if maybe we're not sure how one group would, we're not sure we agree with you for one group, but then we have a second one. It's like, oh yeah, they get the idea. Okay, anything else on the quizzes? Cool. Okay, one thing that came up in maybe a third or so of the 2-sentence papers from Tuesday was that people still felt a little confused about the implied conclusions example, and a few people in particular suggested putting it in premise conclusion form so they could see exactly how it works. So that's what I did right here. So remember, we had a pair of posts on Blue Sky by a user, Shiv Ramdas. I think we can put this into premise conclusion form. It's not quite as neat as sort of the canned examples we've been looking at, but it goes something like this. Premise 1, indentured workers could not quit their job or move away at all. Premise 2, records of indentured workers were destroyed or not collected. Premise 3, a job at Twitter does not have these restrictions. Then, I think Shiv Ramdas intended this to support a conclusion that was left implicit, something like this. Therefore, you shouldn't describe a job at Twitter as indentured servitude. That's sort of all Shiv Ramdas was going for, was that this term, indentured servitude, shouldn't be used for people who work at Twitter today. Something along those lines. Mina, on the other hand, read this as having the implied conclusion that workers at Twitter are not exploited, or some other kind of defense of Elon Musk. Okay. So very, very different conclusions between what Shiv Ramdas intended but left implicit, didn't state explicitly, and the implied conclusion that Meena read into Shiv Ramdas's threat. Does that help? See some nods. Any more questions about that example? Very good. Okay. So last time, we covered a fair amount of ground. We introduced premise, conclusion, form. We kind of just went over that, like what that means. So I'm going to let you all look at that slide again if you want a refresher on premise, conclusion, form. We also started talking about acceptability. We talked about how acceptability isn't based on like belief or deep commitment, with the example of myself as a non-theist or my friend Sabrina, the Zen Buddhist, giving a Christian argument in favor of migration. So we talked a little bit about that. We ended with this slide about assessing acceptability. We recognize that acceptability depends on the context, who is involved in this particular conversation, because acceptability is about whether everyone in the conversation has a good reason to accept the claim. So claims that are acceptable in one conversation might not be acceptable in another, depending on who's involved. And we looked at this one example here. Children have the capacity to make reasoned decisions about their education. We said that middle and high school students and what we might call liberal or progressive parents would probably accept this claim that children have this capacity to make reasoned decisions about their education. While school boards, established school authorities, more what we might call conservative parents, probably wouldn't accept this claim. I'm going to go over another one or two of these examples because we really only did this one. But are there questions about assessing acceptability in general, or this particular example, children have the capacity to make reasoned decisions about their education? Okay, so we have three more examples. I think for the sake of time, we only want to do one or two, but which one of these three are people most interested in thinking about acceptability for? Duncan?
I think, frankly, out of the three remaining,
Uh-huh.
the most interesting one is the first one.
Okay. Okay, good. So let's break into groups for, well, what was the procedure we did on Tuesday? I think it was take a second, read this claim. Abortion should be legal in most cases. See if you can think of a group of people who would probably accept it, a group of people who would probably reject it or not accept it. Then check in with one or maybe two people sitting next to you. So we're not going to do the whole group discussion on this, just a quick check-in with one or maybe two people sitting nearby. So after you've taken a minute, turn to someone sitting next to you. Is it glasses cleaner?
Yes, but it's a very unique one where you can dust with this. You can pull this out and squeegee it, and it's really good.
Oh, I'm actually good, thanks. It was just leftover droplets from the fog.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the weirdest little like kitschy thing that actually works. So I carry it with me everywhere.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, let's come back together. So we want a group who would probably accept this and a group who would probably not accept this. Sahana?
The group who would accept this are people who would describe themselves as pro-choice.
Okay. Jonathan? Yeah, not too hard. I mean, not really hard at all. Anyone come up with any more interesting groups? I mean, these groups are just defined basically by their position on this claim. They're more interesting groups. Is it Ayush? Ayush, sorry. Go ahead. Women's rights groups. Good. Any more interesting answers for pro-life? Duncan?
Statistically, I'd say that utilitarian atheists are probably pretty likely to accept that it should be legal in most cases.
Utilitarian is a specific approach to thinking about ethics. If you take, I think, what are the two? I think we have an Introduction to Ethics course and a course called Contemporary Moral Problems. Both of those are taught at like the introductory level. If you take either of those courses, you will learn about utilitarian ethics. Elizabeth, did you have your hand up? Okay. Any other more interesting ideas for groups who would probably not accept the idea that abortion should be legal in most cases? Yes, Dalen. Christians. I'm going to say conservative Christians. I've known, again, I'm not religious myself at all, but I've known lots of Christians, many of whom are pro-choice. Yeah. Okay, good. Do we need one more? Are we feeling good about this? I don't want to shortchange anything, but we got a lot of ground to cover today. Elizabeth.
I would say more broadly for the religious aspect, I would say just most traditionally religious people. I don't think it's necessarily exclusive to Christians.
Yeah, good. People with traditional religious beliefs. Possibly, yeah. Okay, good. Are we ready to move on to support? I see nods. Okay, good. So support, remember, is the other concept that we use, the other general concept we use when we assess an argument. We put it in premise conclusion form. We look at each of the individual premises and we ask, is this premise taken on its own as an individual claim? Is this acceptable to everyone in the conversation? And then for support, we look at all of the premises as a whole and we think about their relationship to the conclusion. A set of premises provides support for a conclusion when they provide evidence or reasons to accept the conclusion. In my experience, support is the most difficult concept in the class for students to understand. There isn't a good way of defining it that's not super abstract, like providing reasons or evidence. Well, what does that mean? And I think the biggest struggle that a lot of students have is, in the examples we're going to look at here in a second, and in a lot of the examples we've seen so far, it's pretty easy to get like a clear intuition, oh yeah, these premises do provide support, those premises don't. But in a lot of other arguments that haven't been specially prepared for use in this class, it can be very difficult to tell whether or not a set of premises provides support. And there aren't a general set of tools that you can bring to absolutely any argument to assess support. You need different kinds of tools for different kinds of arguments. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second after we go over these initial examples, which are meant to illustrate the idea that support comes in degrees. So first, I was going to bring my helmet in, but I didn't. But that is an evidence for premise 2 here. Okay, so first, premise 1. Professor Hicks is often seen riding a bike around campus. Premise 2, Professor Hicks often has a helmet clipped to their bag. I forgot I was going to leave it clipped to my bag today. It's sitting in my office in Cobb 1. But I do often have a helmet clipped to my bag. If you've taken other classes with me, you have probably seen my helmet clipped to my bag. These two premises provide evidence that I commute to campus by bike. And if we accept this first conclusion, that I commute to campus by bike, then that gives further evidence that I live close to campus, close enough to bike into campus. Okay? So these two premises, if we accept them, they provide evidence, first, that I commute to campus by bike, and second, that I live close to campus. These premises don't provide an absolute guarantee for the conclusion. Maybe I ride my bike to take an exercise break in the middle of the day. And I come to campus by car or whatever, and my bike is here, and I get on my bike and I go for a bike ride in the middle of the day, and that's why people see me, that's why I carry my helmet around, but I don't commute by bike. Okay? So these premises don't provide an absolute guarantee of the conclusion that I commute by bike. And similarly, just because I commute by bike doesn't necessarily mean I live close to campus. You know, if I ride an e-bike, or I'm a really fast bike rider, or I have a lot of stamina as a bike rider, you know, maybe I live like 10 or 15 miles away, and I just do a long bike commute. So with this first argument, the premises provide support, but they don't absolutely guarantee the conclusion. It's possible for these conclusions to be wrong, even with the premises. Contrast that with the two other arguments on the right-hand side. First, all cats, without exception, love to watch birds. Jasper is a cat, therefore Jasper loves to watch birds. If we accept that first premise, literally, without exception, all cats love to watch birds, and that Jasper is indeed a cat, then we get an absolute guarantee that Jasper loves to watch birds. It's basically impossible for those premises to be true and the conclusion false. So here, these premises, if we accept them, provide very strong evidence or very strong support to guarantee their conclusion. Kind of similar with the second example, UC students are required to have a GPA of 3.0 or better in high school. If Marty is a UC student, then we can conclude with absolute certainty that Marty had a GPA of 3.0 or better in high school. Setting aside the complexities of transfer students and stuff like that. These premises guarantee their conclusion. So the two examples on the right-hand side provide very strong absolute support to the conclusion, assuming we accept the premises. The left-hand side, support is much weaker. There's still support for these conclusions about me, but it's not the absolute guarantee, absolute certainty. Okay, so support can come in degrees. Now, I was saying a few minutes ago, you need different kinds of tools to analyze support in different kinds of arguments. If you take Phil 5, which is our formal logic class, you'll learn some really powerful, almost mathematical tools that are designed for these kinds of arguments on the right. So when we're talking about arguments where the premises are supposed to give an absolute guarantee for their conclusion, then we can bring in the kind of tools that you learn about if you take Phil 5. The problem is these kinds of arguments are pretty rare out in the real world. So the focus of this class is on arguments like we have on the left-hand side, where the premises provide some support for the conclusion, but not an absolute guarantee. And in addition, different kinds of arguments on the left-hand side have support work in different ways, and so we need even more specific kinds of tools. So after we finish this first unit, we're going to look at generalizations, or looking at kind of statistical inference from a sample to a population. That requires one set of tools to think about what we call a representative sample and the data generating process. Then we're going to move on to arguments where we're looking at things that an expert tells us and whether or not we should trust them. That requires a completely different set of concepts to figure out whether or not we should trust what an expert says. So this class is about developing tools for analyzing support of specific kinds of arguments where the premises provide support, or might provide support, without being an absolute guarantee. Okay, all preliminary stuff there, but are there any comments before we move on? Oh, take-home message from this is that I'm not going to ask you to assess the support of any arguments in any of the Unit 1 assessments. Like this quiz, the argument maps quiz next week, the third assessment, I'm not asking you to assess support. When we look at particular arguments, we will be developing particular kinds of tools to assess support for those arguments, and then we can really assess support. But we don't have those tools yet, so I'm not asking you to do that. But we have to think carefully about the relationship between support and some other concepts. So, first of all, acceptable premises don't necessarily provide support. So we need to separate acceptability from support. First example. Professor Hicks lives with two cats, Jasper and Jag. Hopefully, you all have enough evidence now to accept this premise that I live with these two cats. Conclusion, Professor Hicks teaches critical reasoning. This premise about the cats doesn't provide any evidence or reason to believe that I teach critical reasoning or that I'm a teacher at all. There's no support here. The premise is acceptable. You have independent reasons to accept the conclusion, but this particular premise does not support this particular conclusion. Here's another one. Einstein developed the theory of relativity. Einstein worked as a patent clerk. Therefore, working as a patent clerk helps develop physics theories. Both of these premises are acceptable if you know anything about the biography of Albert Einstein. These premises are acceptable, but they don't provide support for this conclusion that working as a patent clerk helps you develop physics theories. Take a second, see if you can explain to yourself why. Why does support break down in this example about Einstein? And once you've thought about it, talk about it at your tables for a second. Why does support break down in the second example? Why try
to
to
necessarily
spell this out a little more?
been there.
Wanted to bring in the rest of you.
That's right, we are in a
Were you
long
waiting to grab one?
lecture, which means I can go walk to the front and grab an apple.
Good. It's hard to articulate, right? Okay, let's come back together. As a reminder, apples, peanut butter packets, and I brought napkins because I noticed a couple people had issues with peanut butter last time. Okay. So, do that. Oh, come on. Okay, so Einstein developed the theory of relativity. Einstein worked as a patent clerk. These two claims are acceptable. Read the Wikipedia page on Albert Einstein. In 30 seconds, you can find both of these. Conclusion, therefore, working as a patent clerk helps develop physics theories. That doesn't seem to be right. Thomas, if you don't mind me calling you out, had an interesting but ultimately incorrect thought that maybe these happened at two different points in Einstein's life. Maybe he was working at a patent clerk at one point, and maybe later on he developed the theory of relativity. Unfortunately, his initial work on the theory of relativity happened at the same time that he was working as a patent clerk. So, good idea that unfortunately didn't turn out in this case. So what's gone wrong here? Eric?
So this is using a single example of Einstein, and it's basically saying that there's a correlation between developing physics theories and working as a patent clerk,
Uh-huh.
but we can't assume for causation through the correlation.
Yeah, good. So one issue here is that this is only a single example. We only have this one example of Einstein. When we start talking about generalizations, the first rule we're going to use for generalizations is that you need more than one example. So that's an important weakness here, is that we only have the one example of Einstein, and there are lots of people who work as patent clerks and didn't go on to develop physics theories. Duncan.
This is cheating a little because I'm in Physico 05, and we've looked at arguments similar to this.
Mhm.
One of the other ways you can say, hey, these premises don't inherently mean that the conclusion follows is if we accept both of the premises as true,
Mhm.
and we construct a counterexample that doesn't violate either of the premises,
Mhm.
which we can, and still has the conclusion be false, which we also can. So let's presuppose some other person
Mhm.
works at, well, actually, we don't need some other person. Einstein works as a patent clerk. Einstein developed the theory of relativity. Let us imagine a world in which it just didn't help him at all. That doesn't violate either of the premises, but it does lead to the conclusion not being true. We can construct a scenario in which that is the case. It doesn't break either of the premises.
Yeah, good. We have to be careful about thinking in terms of counterexamples in this class, because we're primarily going to be working with arguments on the left-hand side. And we said, for the argument about like the evidence that I commute by bike and live close to campus, there's some support there. We can imagine counterexamples, which I did, right? Suppose I'm not commuting by bike, I'm taking exercise breaks in the middle of the day, and that's why people see me on my bike and so on. So that counterexample means that these premises don't guarantee the conclusion, which is what Phil 5 is interested in, but they still provide pretty decent evidence to support the conclusion here. So the notion of support can be weaker than what happens in Phil 5. So that's why we have to be careful with counterexamples. But I think the idea, the basic idea that working as a patent clerk doesn't do anything to help you develop physics theories. You need to have a background in physics. You need to be really good at math. You need to maybe have access to a lab where you're doing experimental research, or you need to have sort of the time and the mathematical skill to do the kind of theoretical work that Einstein was doing as a patent clerk. And being as a patent clerk doesn't give you those things that make it easier to develop physics theories. So I think this is the problem with this argument, is that we don't have, the way Eric put it in terms of causation, we don't have a reason why there's a causal relationship between being a patent clerk and developing physics theories. Any other questions about this example? Primary upshot is acceptable premises that don't support the conclusion. Third example, one of my favorites. Slightly stale popcorn. You know, popcorn that's like a day old. You went to the movies and you brought half the bag home with you. Slightly stale popcorn is better than nothing. Well, nothing is better than eternal happiness. So slightly stale popcorn is better than eternal happiness. What's gone wrong here? Think about that. See if you can explain what's gone wrong in this example, then discuss at your tables. Okay, let's come back together. So forget eternal happiness when you can just have slightly stale popcorn. What's gone wrong here? Jonathan.
In the first context, you're using nothing to describe the noun of literally nothing, and in the second one, you're using it as a grouping for there is like no thing, as in like there's nothing that fits the category where it would be better than eternal happiness.
Okay, Eric?
So I believe the word nothing here means, in both cases, it's basically not comparable to anything else. And you're using that exact word to compare two things, maybe three things again,
Mm-hmm.
which basically causes a problem in this case.
Yeah, part of the problem here is we're treating nothing as though it were an object, and we could do this comparison between these three different objects. Why can't we treat nothing as an object? Actually, I want somebody over here. Maybe somebody from table 3? Thoughts? Sahana?
Because nothing is literally, or well, I guess more abstractly, just not really any specific thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is a really hard one to articulate clearly. If you take, I think at the very end of Phil 5, or Phil 160, which is also Math 160. In those classes, you can start to develop some tools to be very precise about what nothing means in these two different contexts. For our purposes, we can just rewrite premise 2 as eternal happiness is better than everything else. Make this whole thing a little smaller. So, eternal happiness is better than everything else. Does this have the same meaning as nothing is better than eternal happiness? Kind of?
Like, technically, in the context, it does.
Mm-hmm.
But the way of phrasing it has more like it's like substance, not like meaningful substance, but like just like more stuff in it.
More stuff in
I don't know how to describe it, but like when you put
Okay.
it that way, there's more to think about because you start thinking about what everything else is rather than what nothing would be.
Okay. Duncan?
There is kind of sort of one technical change, which is that nothing, no thing is better than eternal happiness specifies very precisely that eternal happiness is not better than itself. This specifies that everything excluding eternal happiness is worse than eternal happiness. So there's one technical change.
That's very, yeah, yeah.
Be better than eternal happiness.
Okay, there is that very small technical difference, but I think for our purposes, especially since I want to move on, eternal happiness is better than everything else says pretty much the same thing as nothing is better than eternal happiness. But when we rewrite this premise, now it doesn't seem to, the feeling of like, oh, it's supposed to support the conclusion somehow, that goes away. Slightly stale popcorn is better than nothing. Eternal happiness is better than everything else. I mean, you don't really get anything in particular from those two premises the way you got this conclusion from the first version of premise 2. Again, the take-home message here is we can have acceptable premises. They don't necessarily provide support for the conclusion. So these are two different concepts. Questions about that? Okay. I'm going to skip this. I'm going to recommend polyphony. I think this would be a really good exercise to do in discussion section. This is taking this argument, identify the conclusion, put it in premise conclusion form, and then explain why these premises, which are more or less acceptable, don't support the conclusion. Okay, so we just said acceptable premises don't necessarily provide support. We can go the other direction. Premises that provide support are not necessarily acceptable. Students have a surprising amount of time understanding this. So I'm going to give a series of silly examples and then a more subtle one that hopefully will help you understand that. When we assess support, we temporarily accept the premises, or we assume for the moment that everyone involved in the conversation would accept the premises, whatever they are. So, first argument, premise, Biden has a secret plan to force us all to become slaves on the moon. This is a ridiculous premise. I don't think I've encountered any conspiracy theorist, no matter how outlandish, who thinks Biden wanted to make us moon slaves. However, when we assess support, we temporarily accept that premise. So we accept, for the moment, that Biden did indeed have a secret plan to force us all to become slaves on the moon. Now, if you accept that premise, that's a really good reason to vote against Biden. If we accept that Biden has a secret moon slave plan, I don't want to become a moon slave. No one wants to become a moon slave. And so we have a really good reason to vote against Biden. So this premise provides really strong support, but is absolutely unacceptable. Second example, almost as silly. Vaccines contain mind control chips. Therefore, we should strengthen informed consent requirements for vaccines. This one, there are some people you can find, if you spend enough time online, who sincerely believe that vaccines contain mind control chips. Even a couple of people who are prominent political figures seem to sincerely believe that vaccines contain mind control chips. Almost everyone else would not accept this premise. But when we think about support, we temporarily accept the premise, okay, for the moment, we'll accept the idea that vaccines contain mind control chips. If we accept that, then yeah, there's pretty good reason to strengthen informed consent requirements for vaccines, because no one should have a mind control chip implanted in them against their will. So when we assess support, we temporarily accept the premises, no matter how ridiculous, outlandish, or that we disagree with. And we ask, okay, if someone did accept this, would that give a reason to accept the conclusion? Question on the first two outlandish examples. Okay. The third one is not outlandish, more subtle. I'll say, in this one, the support is clear, maybe not immediately obvious, but if you think about it for a second. So first premise, we define murder as the intentional killing of a human being. Second premise, abortion involves the intentional killing of a human being. Conclusion, therefore, abortion is murder. So the first premise is giving a definition. The second premise says abortion satisfies this definition. You put those together, straightforwardly, we get support for the conclusion that abortion is murder. So in this argument, very good support for the conclusion. The premises are not necessarily acceptable. Relates back to the example we had like 4 slides ago. Let's take a second, think about why. In your group, explain why these premises are not necessarily acceptable. Okay, let's come back together. So I'm not saying here that these premises are obviously unacceptable. My claim here is just that they are not necessarily acceptable. Why is that? Shri?
Because
justify an abortion, as in like, the same way you could justify murder as like in self-defense.
Good. So, because Sri was a little quiet, and I'm going to paraphrase. Premise 2 is a claim that might not be accepted by a lot of pro-choice people. Pro-choice people might say that abortion can be justified in certain circumstances. Or they might say it's not intentional killing. Or they might argue that a developing fetus is not yet a human being in a certain sense. Okay? So, in a conversation that involved people who held these views, they probably wouldn't accept the second premise. The premises would still provide support. So, conversation, I'm pro-choice. My conservative family member is pro-life. In a conversation between the two of us, I wouldn't accept premise 2, but the premises would still provide support. If I did accept premise 2 and premise 1, I would have a pretty compelling argument that abortion is murder. Questions, comments, thoughts? Yeah, Sahana.
Since manslaughter can be described in courts as second-degree murder,
Mm-hmm.
then I feel like that would bring into question the definition of murder as intentional killing
Mm-hmm.
without the word premeditated in there also.
Yeah, good. You might also have people who reject or question the first premise. So there might be context, for example, maybe if a lawyer specializing in murder and manslaughter cases is involved in the conversation, they might say, premise 1 is a little too simplistic. We need a better definition of murder. That is a possibility as well. Even in that context, though, the premises wouldn't be acceptable, but they would still provide support. Because if that lawyer said, okay, for the sake of this argument with a bunch of college students who don't care about the details of criminal law, for the sake of this conversation, if I accept this argument and I accept premise 2, then those two premises give a reason to accept the conclusion. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Eric, did you have something?
Yeah. So, are you basically saying that this is acceptable?
What I'm saying is these two premises together, if we temporarily accept them, whatever our other feelings, whether we would actually accept them or not, if we temporarily accept them, they provide a pretty compelling argument for the conclusion. And so they provide support. In some contexts, they'll be totally acceptable. So, if you go to, say, a pro-life rally, probably everybody there would accept these two premises. But in other contexts, they probably wouldn't be acceptable. And so my point is they're not necessarily acceptable. And the really important point here, the take-home message of the whole slide, is that just because the premises provide support doesn't make them acceptable. So we can have cases like the ones on this slide where the premises provide support. If you accepted them, you'd have a good argument for the conclusion, so they provide support. But they're either not acceptable at all, like Biden's secret moonslave plan, or they're not acceptable in certain contexts, like the abortion example. I see nods. Another common confusion, premises with numbers. So, oh, that's why this is here. So this one is actually about acceptability rather than support, but I put it here because it relates to getting acceptability and support confused. So consider this argument. 67% of UC Merced students think the campus mascot should be changed to an aardvark. Therefore, the campus mascot should be changed to an aardvark. Okay. In previous versions of this class, I would have sort of the quiz on this stuff, and I would give an argument like this where the premise had a number in it. And a lot of students would give me an answer something like this. They would say that this premise, premise 1, is acceptable because it's based on evidence. Or this premise is acceptable because it's giving a precise value. Point of this example is this premise is not acceptable. I made this number up. I have no idea what percentage of UC Merced students think the campus mascot should be changed to an aardvark. I'm guessing not many. I'm guessing way less than 67%. Okay. Unless somebody has actually done the survey, no one has a good reason to accept this premise. So this premise is basically not acceptable to anyone. Kind of for the same reason like vaccines have mind control chips. It's not really acceptable to anyone. So this premise is not acceptable. The reason why I put it here is because this premise does provide support. Can somebody explain why? Why does this premise provide support? Ayusha? Yeah, good. If we accept this premise for the moment, it's not acceptable, but if we do for the moment, we accept this premise that a supermajority of students think the campus mascot should be changed, and we use an implied premise that we should go with what the majority of students think, then we get at least some support for the conclusion. Right? We have at least some reason why the campus mascot should be changed to an aardvark. So this premise provides support. And a thing about our society, the US today, which is interesting, it's really changed over the past 20, 30 years, just in my lifetime. We put a lot of emphasis on data and quantifiable evidence. So in our culture, this quantitative premise, assuming it's acceptable, it provides a lot of support, right? The idea that we did a survey of people and got this quantitative number, in our society, that provides really strong support. Compared to arguments about like, say, aardvarks are super inspiring or they're super cute or something like that. That kind of argument wouldn't provide a lot of support that a quantitative premise would. So I think students were looking at this, at examples like this, and saying, oh, this premise provides a lot of support. If we accept it, it provides really good evidence to support the conclusion. But that's not what was being asked here. What was being asked was not, does this premise provide support, but rather, is this premise acceptable? And this premise is not acceptable because I literally just made it up. Questions or comments on that? Just reiterating in a specific way the difference between acceptance and support. Okay, we got 4 minutes. Yeah, we could do this in 4 minutes. Okay. This is just reiterating some stuff about the Unit 1 quizzes that I said a few minutes ago. The quizzes for Unit 1 will not ask you to assess support. We don't have the tools for that yet. Different kinds of arguments have different requirements for support, so we're going to be developing some specific tools for specific kinds of arguments. What you will be asked on the quiz is to answer true-false questions about acceptability and support. So we'll do these, and I think that will take us just to time. First, if a premise comes from a peer-reviewed scientific study, it is automatically acceptable in any argument. Is that true or false? If a premise comes from a peer-reviewed scientific study, it is automatically acceptable in any argument. Sahana?
I'd say it would depend on the topic of the study and the topic of the argument.
Good. So true, false. Is this sentence true or false?
False.
Correct. So this sentence is false. Depends on the context, depends on who's involved. We may have people involved in the conversation who put less weight on scientific studies. Or maybe I'm not going to say that sentence. Okay, good. So this one, in this case, it's false. Because depending on the context, people involved might not automatically accept a piece of scientific finding. Number 2, the more precise and detailed a premise is, the more support it provides for the conclusion. True or false? Duncan?
I have a really funny way of saying my answer to this one.
Okay.
One time in 1933 in Kentucky, Northern, a man living with his wife and 2 kids bought a house. And then he found out that the house did not contain truth in this statement. It's very precise, very, very precise thing.
Good.
Could be even more precise, but it really didn't support his statement.
Yeah, good. So an elaborate anecdote, lots of details, lots of precision that were completely irrelevant to the conclusion. So this claim is also false. You can have lots of precision and lots of detail that is completely irrelevant to the conclusion, and so doesn't provide support. One more. An argument can fail either because its premises aren't acceptable or because they don't support the conclusion.
Clarification question.
Yeah?
What do you mean by fail? What part of the argument failed? You convincing somebody?
More or less. Is this one true or false? An argument can fail either because its premises are acceptable or because they don't support the conclusion. Ayush? Say again a little louder. Yeah, this one is true. This one is basically asking, what are the 2 things we look for when we assess an argument? We look to see if its premises are acceptable, each taken individually, and we look to see, taken collectively, do they support this particular conclusion? So this one is true. Any questions about those? Any final questions for today? Okay, great work this week. Remember to come to the discussion section. And best of luck on the quiz. Remember, if you have trouble with it and you don't pass, it's fine. You'll have another shot next week. Otherwise, have a great rest of your Thursday and a great weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday.
Using that, by the way.